This is the story of how I went from a damaged car in 15th place to a win in the Top Split Manufacturers Cup at a very rainy Nürburgring. I didn't start in 15th place, however, and that is where the story gets really interesting. Despite running into traffic and having to slow down dramatically during my qualifying lap, I still managed to put it in 2nd place. If you're familiar with the Group 3 M6 in Gran Turismo 7, then you know it's incredibly fast around the Nürburgring, as long as it's dry, and unfortunately, this was not dry whatsoever. On top of that, the next 3 cars behind me are known for having excellent traction in the wet. This was actually the 2nd slot. I didn't do great in the 1st slot, so I wanted to take my chance because I knew I had good pace here, so we loaded up the 2nd slot. I also had a false sense of security because in the 1st slot, I didn't have any issues with traction, or at the very least, I didn't have any issues with cars overtaking me at the very beginning of the race. This was a much different story, as you're about to see. I generally don't like driving with traction control in Gran Turismo for the most part, and I didn't have any issues with the 1st slot like I mentioned, so once again, I chose not to use traction control, and that was a massive mistake. Before we even approached the braking zone for the 1st corner, I was already overtaken by one of the Porsches, and the next one was already really close. On top of that, the Porsche in front of me slowed down earlier than I expected, and Mr. Lester went for a very deep move, which meant that I actually lost 5 places just in T1. One of the biggest things I've been working on, and something I think a lot of sim racers need to work on, is not letting all the issues combine and cascade into a much bigger issue. Obviously, absolutely no one wants to lose 5 positions in the very 1st corner of a race, but it's a long one. We've got 5 laps of the Nürburgring 24, and that means that a lot of opportunities are going to be there for us to make overtakes, better strategy decisions, and of course, just get better luck. I remember distinctly going into this corner and looking behind myself and seeing the gentleman named Pranav Superstar. The reason that really struck me is because previously, the best race recovery I had ever done was from 7th place to a win here, and I was in 7th place because that gentleman behind me punted me after I'd already lost 3 or 4 places. Remembering what I was able to do that day kept me focused. With our friend Boltex spinning out right there, sorry Boltex, that meant we already had 1 position, so technically it's only 5 left to go. Now when I make guides on this channel, I frequently talk about the strategy of knowing your opponents. Lester is a fantastic driver. He's been a GT Academy finalist, a multi-time GTWS and FIA competitor, and he's just a fantastic dude. He's a good friend of mine. Grove's always a competitor, and Valverde in front was actually racing incredibly tough in the last race. So I was absolutely certain that Valverde would go for a move, and here we go. When other people are making moves like this, when people are being extremely aggressive, that's just another opportunity for you to strike. I'm also very confident while driving in the rain and on this track in general, so I'm going to go for every opportunity that I see. Even if it might not work out, I'm still going to go for it. Even if your move doesn't work, at least you let the people in front know that you're going to be aggressive and you're not going to let anything slide. The unfortunate part about being in this position is all 3 of the cars in front have much better wet traction. But if you've been watching this race at all, you'll know that it's kind of a scripted race. We know exactly when it's going to start drying up, exactly when it's going to dry up completely, and exactly when we need to pit in order to have the best pace. On top of that, after racing all of these guys in the last race, I also knew that I had better pace in any condition for the last half of the track. Driving in the rain can be absolutely daunting for a lot of people, but it's absolutely my favorite way to race. I mentioned that Lester ahead of us was in the GT Academy Finals in 2014, and that's actually when I met him. And we did a number of land races. The one race that I won was in an S15 at a very wet Ascari, and I won by 9 seconds. The previous year's champion, Nick McMillan, was there doing commentary and helping out all the drivers. And when they commented on my rain pace, Nick said it's because, since we both live in Oregon, we both have to dodge slow drivers in the rain all the time. It rains 9 months out of the year here. But anyways, I digress. I got really lucky right there. It looked like Mike just lost a little bit of traction, and I had a very, very good exit from that last corner, so I was able to make 1 position right there. Now, I did mention that the Porsche and the Mercedes both have better wet traction, but this car has a much better top speed, so if I'm within their slipstream, there's a good chance that as soon as we get to any kind of straight, I'm going to be able to pass them. And if I can get ahead of Valverde specifically, I knew that my pace on the second half of the track was much better, so if I could get ahead, then I was going to be able to just run away. In order to make use of that opportunity, however, I was going to have to stay in front of Mike and stay very close to the 2 ahead of me through one of the most twisty parts of the track. Now, it's obviously one thing attacking in the rain, it's another thing defending in the rain, but when you have to do both, it can be really, really nerve-wracking. But luckily I was able to maintain my focus throughout here, and we kept it clean. One of the things that's relatively new in GTWS is heavy damage. Most of the time we have light damage, which in this game means if you take any damage, it lasts for something like 30 seconds. However, with heavy damage, it lasts until you take a pit. And if you have to pit any time except the specific prescribed time, it's going to completely ruin your race. Since this is a scripted race, we all know exactly what the best strategy is, so if we have to deviate from that, it's going to be very difficult to find any kind of success. I mention it now because I was close to the man 2 positions ahead in this very corner when I took damage the last race. For better or worse, he was pulling away here and the field kind of spread out, so I didn't really have to worry about that at all right now. Another thing that you see pretty often in Gran Turismo races specifically is people deciding silently just to work with each other. If you know someone has better pace than you, a lot of the time you're not going to be very aggressive with them, at least until the end. What happens is at the beginning of a race, if you know someone is faster than you at the beginning, then you're usually going to work with them so that you don't let the people behind you close in on you. Sometimes that's not the best idea though, and so being overly aggressive even with someone that you know is faster than you through a certain part of the track, well, that can work out to your advantage too. Now, I wasn't absolutely sure, but I was mostly sure that I was going to be faster than Mike, so I didn't expect him to attack here. But of course, it's well within his rights, and he went for it right here. Not expecting it though, I braked too late. And this was the beginning of my temporary downfall. As far as incidents go, that is the best case scenario. I might have lost a ton of positions, but I didn't take any damage, so I was still going to be able to make something work. And in fact, we were still only 10 seconds away from the leader after having not been close to him the entire race. I mentioned at the beginning of the race that one of the biggest things I'm working on is trying not to let myself cascade into emotions and just getting really angry with myself over situations like this. And to be 100% honest, I was really struggling with that right now. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to pull anything off at all, and so I completely lost my focus. One of the main things I was thinking about at this point was this is exactly where I was trying to make my overtake. This is where I wanted to make a move, and instead I've lost multiple positions again. It's in these moments that I have to remind myself that the only thing I can really do to affect the future of the race is drive as well as I possibly can. In the past, I had really struggled with the section of the track after the carousel. I had thrown away some really good race results entirely based on my lack of pace after the carousel, and so I've spent a lot of time practicing at this part of the track. All that confidence I'd built up, however, kind of worked against me because I was still unable to focus. I was still reeling over the stupid mistake that I made. Whenever I'm half focused on the race and half focused on the stupid mistakes I make, anything else that goes wrong just makes it that much worse for me. And so you might be able to see that I'm not really hitting my lines. My throttle works really sloppy. I ran into that guy when he slowed down unexpectedly, and so I was just not in control here. My only solace at this point was seeing that Pranav Superstar had a half-second penalty. Half-second might not seem that long, but you have to serve it at the very beginning of the longest straight on the track, so really it affects you much more than a half-second. When I had run into Walson previously in the lap, I probably should have figured out that I'm going to need to give him more space. On top of the fact that Payme and Pranav were also battling, I should have known that he was going to check up here, and instead I just tried to brake at the normal braking point that I usually use. Bumping into him absolutely destroyed my momentum, and so it made the person behind me run into me, and that's what gave me the damage. Running off into the wall didn't actually do anything, but I now had rear damage. On top of the damage I just took, I should have paid attention to the fact that I went all 4 tires off the track, and that gives you dirty tires. It's like an on-off switch. If you go off the track with all 4 tires and nothing before that, then you automatically have really low grip for a predetermined amount of time. Since I had a lot less momentum going into YouTube corner, I hadn't really felt it, but as soon as I got back up to speed and tried to take the corner after that, that's when the dirty tires really kicked in, and that's how I almost went off after that, losing all of those other positions and putting me back in 15th place. I'm not sure about Mike Honcho. I don't race him very often, and usually he's not in the top split, so I think that he didn't really have much confidence going into the race, especially considering how he did in quali. So despite the fact that he could have very easily overtaken me there, he just went ahead and checked up and let me have my position. Obviously, I'm thankful for that, but part of me wishes that he overtook me so I could say that I went from last to first in top split manu. Now, having rear damage is kind of a weird thing. It makes you slow down a lot on the straights, and it also makes the car handle kind of funny, but luckily it's symmetrical, so I didn't have to worry about the lefts and the rights being any different. I just had to worry about the car handling a little bit funny and then not having as much top speed. Now, I'm not sure if Plaka Plum just lifted off here or if the Mustang really is this sad in the straights, but I was very thankful to be able to get in front of him. Shout out to Plaka Plum, by the way. He's a lovely dude. Now, Ortiz definitely had to serve a penalty, so I was able just to use the momentum after passing the Mustang to then use his slip a little bit past him, and then I was still in the Ferrari slipstream. Despite our compromised top speed because of the damage, the Ferrari has pretty low top speed because of the BOP, and so I knew that I was going to be able to just catch up and get closer and closer to him going into the next lap. Obviously, that's good, but it also meant that I was going to have to make as many passes as I possibly could before we got out of the GP, because when we get to the Nordschleife, I think it's pronounced Nordschleife, it was going to be much more difficult to pull off any overtakes. Not impossible, but much more difficult. Mid-engine cars in Gran Turismo, especially in Group 3, have incredible traction coming out of the corners in the wet. So I was going to have to be very aggressive to make any kind of passes on any of these guys. So I was doing everything I could to get up close to them and braking, and then just try to position myself so they couldn't utilize all of that great traction that they had. This was a scary moment, however. I went over that white line and I was absolutely certain that I was going to get a penalty, but luckily I did not. I also didn't make any positions up, but I was in a better position than Pranav because I was confident that I was going to be faster than him throughout the entirety of the track, so I got extremely aggressive. Luckily, it stayed clean between myself and Pranav. We've had a very rough history, but we haven't had any kind of incidents lately, so I'm continuing to give him the benefit of the doubt. And with that, we're now in 12th place. If you look at the meter that's on the left next to the tires, it shows you how much water is on the track surface. Anywhere in the middle sector means that you're good on intermediates, the top is wets, and the bottom means it's probably pretty sketchy, but you can use the slicks. The M6 struggled a lot on the first lap because we should have had wet tires, but using wet tires doesn't make a lot of sense in this race specifically because it becomes much less wet as soon as the second lap starts, and so now we had a little bit more of an advantage than we did before. That meant that I had even more confidence than I had on the first lap, so again, I was going to be very aggressive. It also seemed to be that Lady Fortune was smiling on me because that Ferrari gave me all the space in the world, or at least exactly as much space as I needed, and so I was very cleanly able to get past him. I needed to make as many overtakes as I possibly could leading into the Nordschleife, but we were able to make only 2. Obviously that's not bad, but there were so many more people in front of us. Now, leading into this first sector of the Nordschleife, I knew that I was going to probably be faster than Walson and maybe Payme just because their cars aren't exactly great in the wet, but Boltex was going to be an interesting factor because the Porsche, like I've been saying, is incredibly good in the wet. But the fact that they're all battling and Boltex is going for moves, everyone else is trying to jockey for position, that meant there's probably going to be at least a little bit of an opportunity to try to make something happen and a really high chance of an incident happening. So I obviously had to be careful, but since I had already lost so much, I wasn't too worried about anything going wrong, and really I was just going to look for opportunities to try to get in front of everyone. After Flugplatz is a really long high-speed section, and so I knew that if I could stick close to these guys, I was probably going to be able to pick off at least one of them leading into the next braking zone. Flugplatz is also a very scary corner when it comes to the rain, and not a lot of people are super confident with it. Some are too confident, however, and so that can also play a part. As we accelerated out, it became pretty obvious that I was going to have a really good run compared to the people ahead. However, I did not expect Boltex to have such a good run on Walson, so when he started going for the move, it made it really difficult for me to try to do anything at all. It's in these situations that I'd really like to follow directly behind someone making an overtake. If you can stay really close to them, then you can make sure that the person can't close the door, but unfortunately, Boltex was able to go much faster. I ran into Walson one more time on accident and almost got rear-ended, but I was able to save it. Unfortunately for our buddy KP, he went off there. After rear-ending Walson 3 times in just 1.5 laps, I realized that I needed to stop being quite as aggressive, and I needed to wait until I had a very good opportunity to make a pass. Remembering my initial plan from the first lap that didn't quite go as well, I wanted to wait until this last full throttle section before the carousel to make my move, and luckily, the opportunity presented itself. The Lexus doesn't quite have the top speed that the M6 does, even when I have damage, so I was able to get right up next to him, leading into this corner, which can be very sketchy. This is actually the corner where I threw away my very first 400, which I still haven't gotten. and I was very lucky to just stay on the track there. On top of that, as you can see, there's a drying line already, which means that things can get really sketchy if you have 2 tires on the dry and 2 tires on the wet. I think that's exactly what happened to our buddy Bape right there. I didn't actually expect to make this pass work, but as I had the inside line on the carousel, it was pretty much a wrap at that point. With the Supra driver out of the carousel, that was another free position, and we found ourselves back in 7th place on just lap 2. So now I find myself behind 2 Porsches, and with the rain almost completely gone, that means that the advantage that they used to have no longer exists. My thought now was, if I can stick just close enough to these guys, by that back straight, I was going to be able to pass all 3 of these dudes if I was close enough. Despite that being in my mind, I don't think I even realized that the leader was only 4 seconds ahead of us at this point. I also wasn't about to just give up on any positions before that straight too. Like I said before, I've been practicing this section after the carousel a lot more than any of the other parts of the track, so I was extremely confident here. You can see me putting myself in position to try to make a move on Boltex, but it didn't quite show up just yet. But here at YouTube Corner, I was extremely confident. I'm assuming that since he was so close to Lester, he wasn't able to focus on his exit quite as much as I was able to. And since it's our buddy Boltex, I knew that I can trust him. And it's really funny. I talk about this frequently, but the fact that you can trust someone can sometimes work to their disadvantage. Since I know I can trust him, I can put myself in a crazy position in a crazy part of the track and know that I don't have to worry about him hitting me. And because of that, I was in a better position for that right-hander, and I was able to take that position before the last straight. With all of that work that was going on, I didn't realize that Valverde had gotten so far ahead, and so it was going to be pretty difficult to get in front of him, but at the very least, if I stick close to Lester, I knew that I was going to be able to get in front of him before the end of that straight. Lester is absolutely one of my favorite people on earth to race against. I've looked up to him since before I got to compete against him in GT Academy, and if you follow Gran Turismo, you're probably very familiar with him. I make this analogy a lot, but it's like he's a really good sparring partner. In martial arts, if you have a sparring partner who will absolutely go as hard as they possibly can against you and not give you even an inch of space, really try to do whatever they can to beat you up, that is the kind of person you want to spar against. Because if anyone gives you a really easy fight, they're not really helping you. It might seem nicer to not hurt your friends, but you're really not helping them by going easy, and Lester never goes easy on me. Yes, this entire part of this video just turned into a love letter for Lester, but I think that without being able to race him, I wouldn't be nearly as good as I am right now. So thank you, Lester. Now, if you're familiar with the Supra, it is incredibly fast, especially in a straight line, and I didn't actually see that Supra coming until after I got that bump from Lester. Without that bump from Lester, I would just be a complete sitting duck, but because I got it, I was able to stay all the way in front of that Supra and maintain my position going into the final corners. That ended up being absolutely crucial because I was able to maintain my position going into the pits. The only way you can really do well in this race is by pitting on lap 2. If you're in any of the lower splits or you watched any of the lower splits, you probably saw a lot of people pitting in lap 3 because the track is fully dry by lap 3. However, it's unfortunately much slower. You just have to be extremely careful coming out of the pits, and that's why I was putting on the traction control. As you can see, it only takes 1/1000th of a second to fix all of that rear damage I had, but now I was going to have a completely fixed car, brand new tires, and I just had to be careful exiting the pits. As you can see, it's super wet and a lot of people are slipping out. If you slip out and you go over that line whatsoever, you automatically get a 3-second penalty. I definitely overshot my braking just a little bit, but it wasn't enough to lose a position. We got back on that drawing line and the leader looks like he spun. Now, obviously, I'm going to have to do a lot of work to get ahead of everyone, but with the fastest person on track being the very next person, that meant that, worst case scenario, he's going to make his way to the front, and that's going to part the traffic for me and make it so I have more opportunities to try to make overtakes. This is a tip for anyone who hasn't quite done this type of strategy in any of the rain races in Gran Turismo. And in fact, this is probably something you should do in real life as well if you ever find yourself in a situation like this. But as you can see, there's a drawing line. That means that part of the track is still wet. And since we have slicks, they're not going to grip very well in the wet whatsoever. It also means that all curbs are going to be absolutely deadly, so you do not want to touch them whatsoever. Okay, I take that back. You can use the curbs, but you have to make sure that you're not turning or on the throttle or brakes. If you just glide over any of the curbs in a straight line, you'll probably be okay. But any kind of steering, any kind of throttle, any kind of braking will definitely make you spin immediately, and it will be unrecoverable. That makes what Joao just did much, much more impressive because he had to pass Valverde in the wet. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time calling out other drivers because everyone's done questionable things. I've done questionable things. I've had questionable things done to me. It's just part of racing. You don't always think very clearly in the heat of the moment. But with that said, Valverde made some extremely sketchy moves in the last race, and he's actually responsible for all of the damage, multiple points of damage that I took in the last race, and he outright ruined a few people's races. So, as much as I wanted to be very aggressive if an opportunity arose, I was also going to be very cautious around him. The way that I take this first sector on the Nordschleife is usually through the curbs. I actually abuse the hell out of these curbs. I like to go mostly on the curbs through this section, so I have to consciously think about taking a completely different line because if you go over the curbs, you're just going to end up turned around. It's difficult enough adapting a different line in the middle of a race, but of course, when you also have to worry about what the people in front of you are doing, it's extra difficult. And, as I said before, Valverde was doing something a little crazy. Now, obviously, people should be able to go for an overtake when they want, but there are places where it's just absolutely insane to go for an overtake. In the best case scenario, if he got next to Joao at that point and was able to cleanly overtake him, then one of them was going to lose a position and it could easily be him. There's no way that they were both going to be able to stay in front of me by taking that compromised line. It was just a completely short-sighted move, so you can judge for yourself what you thought of that. And this is actually when I started feeling really good about the end of the race. We still had nearly 3 laps left since we had just started the 3rd lap, and I knew that I was much faster than Valverde through the majority of this track, so as soon as I can make an overtake, I was going to go for it. Now, I don't know if it was just his driving or if my pressure was actually starting to work on him, but he had already started missing his lines and it was getting a little crazy. I was able to stick right to his bumper throughout that entire section. I remember distinctly thinking, however, that I should slow down just a little bit because this next corner is actually where he ended up going really slow and causing the damage that I suffered in the last race, which did ruin my race. So I actually gave him a little bit more space, and then I was very surprised to see that Esteban had taken himself out. So now we're already in podium contention, and we still have 2 laps left. Refocusing one more time, realizing that I'm definitely faster than him on this track, at least with this car combination that we have, I'm just planning on passing him when it comes to that full throttle section where I passed Walson on the previous lap. Now, you may not know this, but the race was actually supposed to get lighter after going to dark, and a few people ended up suffering from this glitch where it just stays completely dark. Now, that might not seem that bad, however, it's incredibly difficult to keep up your pace in the dark. I ended up being 2 to 3 seconds over an entire lap slower in the dark than I was in the light, and so I was at a definite disadvantage, and that is going to come into play a little bit later. Now, I actually don't know why I went for this move. It was kind of a silly move, but it worked out really well. I could have just waited until after this right-hander because I would definitely have more top speed than him. Right now, I'm risking him staying in my slipstream and actually passing at the end. The M6 does have more top speed than the Merc, but most of the cars are able to equalize that just from the slipstream, so I ended up being really lucky that he wasn't able to get in front. So with that, it meant I only had to catch up to Mike Grove by 4.7 seconds with 2 more laps. Fast forward to the end of this lap. The gap is only now 3.1 seconds, which meant that I cut 1.6 seconds out of his lead in only about a half lap. Fast forward again. Final lap, I've cut it down to only 1 second. That means I was 2 seconds faster on that lap alone. If you play Gran Turismo, then you may know that the slipstream is strongest under 1 second. It might actually be as far as 1.2 seconds behind a leading car that you have any kind of effect of slipstream, but under 1 second, it is definitely noticeable and definitely strong, which means that if I can stick with him at least till the end and the very last straight, that's pretty much an automatic overtake. I wasn't just going to bet on that, however, so I was going to do anything I could to make sure that I can get in front of him before then. And as you can see from the last couple laps, I was much, much faster than him. This doesn't mean that it's without its challenges, because anytime you're within slipstream range, that also means you're within dirty air range. So I was going to have to deal with the dirty air from his car as I try to get closer to him and pass. So I definitely wasn't about to be quite as fast as I was when I was driving by myself. His car was also one of the fastest cars on the track, so if he was able to hook it up and actually focus up and go his top pace, then he might be able to hold me off. Now, if you remember me talking from a little bit ago, I said that some people were getting a glitch where it stayed dark, and I was one of those people. He didn't have that glitch, so to him, it was morning. He had all the light he needed, and so I was driving at another disadvantage. I want you to keep that in mind for when I do pass him, by the way. As you already know, this is how I won from 15th place, so you already know the outcome, but I'm going to show you how it happened. Now, I could narrate every little thing that happened on my way to passing him, but I think I'd rather just let the driving speak for itself. At the same spot where I'd planned on passing everyone else anytime I wanted to make a planned move, and where I did end up passing Walson, I was able to pass him. This unfortunately doesn't necessarily work out in my favor, because if he can just stay within a second of me, then he's going to have the slipstream going into the last straight, and the Mazda definitely has better top speed even outside of the slipstream. This is where all of my experience had to come into play, and even though I knew I had to push, I had to be careful, which resulted in me unfortunately pushing just a little bit too much. I keep mentioning that I had the completely dark screen, and it wasn't supposed to be like that. And if you go back and watch his screen, you'll see that he did not have the darkness. So, you might have noticed that he just flashed me, and that was not the last time that he did it. I'm all for being tricky. I am 100% in favor of being tricky and pushing the limits of things that you can do, but sometimes things are just a little bit too sketchy for me to be comfortable with. If you're in a race where your vision is dependent on the light, obviously, and the person behind you does not have that same issue, I'd like to know what you think about them flashing you. Especially flashing you specifically to distract you and hopefully make you make a mistake. Pushing through YouTube corner, my confidence unfortunately got the best of me, and that little moment caused me to completely miss my braking for this corner, which put him directly behind me, and that's when he decided to do that. He's not trying to signal to pass, he's not on a controller, so he didn't accidentally push the button in, making it flash. He was deliberately flashing me, knowing that I had a dark screen and he didn't, hoping to make me make a mistake and crash. Unfortunately for him, he's the one that ended up making the mistake, probably from reaching for that flashing button, and that sealed the deal. With only 7/10 between us, it was still pretty sketchy, but all I had to do was nail these last few corners, and 7/10 was probably going to be too much even if he absolutely nailed it too. But luckily, it wasn't just 7/10. By the time we got to the penultimate corner, I had 1.1 seconds on him. Even if he was in the Supra, which I do believe is the fastest in the class besides the Ford GT, when it comes to the straights, I don't think he would have been able to pass me at this point. The reality was finally setting in of what I had just done. I started in 2nd place, I was in 7th place by Team 1, I made a whole bunch of mistakes, took damage, ended up in 15th place on the 2nd lap, and here, at the end of lap 5, I'm leading. Like I've said many times on this channel, and like I said a couple times in this race specifically, I really don't like calling people out because we all make mistakes and do weird things when it comes to racing, but there are some things that just go beyond the line and some things that I don't consider very sportsmanlike. And flashing when your opponent is in the dark and you're not is definitely across the line for me. And speaking of crossing the line, I'm doing it first. And that is how I won this race.